today we will try to have an overview on the thinkings of two German philosophers, who were tremendously close, I think, to the spirit of several important features of Buddhism. So, first of all, I will speak of Immanuel Kant. So, as you see, Immanuel Kant was born and died in Königsberg. It's in the east and north part of Germany. And he was, his life spanned almost all the 18th century. But first of all, I wish to speak about the context in philosophy. No philosopher is spontaneously born, I would say, but every philosopher has teachers, influences, and a historical context. The context in philosophy was very much influenced by the advent of modern physics also. So we have spoken of Newton, and Newton was really the capital influence on the philosophy of his time. Two philosophers were especially important for Kant. One of them I've already spoken of. It's Leibniz. So Leibniz was this man who tried to understand the world and the laws of nature by saying that they were created by a wise and omniscient God who wished to have a world which was perfect as possible. But, his idea of the perfection of the world is a rational idea. So he gives God the power of having the same kind of reason as human beings, but much more elaborate and much more universal. So it's the reason why the philosophy of Leibniz is called a rationalism, because reason is absolutely everything for him. You remember that even God cannot avoid acting under the principle of sufficient reason. There must be a reason for everything. Okay? So Leibniz was a rationalist, and Kant criticized him, saying that he was a dogmatist, because for him reason was something that could not be shaken. It was an absolute feature, and nothing beyond reason. Instead, there was also another philosopher. I will come to him now, and I will insist on him because he was also very important for the training and the changes of mind of Immanuel Kant. This other philosopher is David Hume. David Hume is not specifically a rationalist. He is not against reason, but for him reason is very secondary. It's not so important. What is very important, according to Hume, is sensibility, sense data, the empirical source of knowledge, namely experience. And David Hume has ideas that are called sometimes skeptical, because he criticized the usual notions of standard philosophy and even of common sense. And his criticism of notions of common sense is amazingly similar to Buddhism, I think. And I think everyone has recognized that since, at least 1 century. Everyone knows that Hume was very close to Buddhism in his ideas, even though he had no influence from Buddhism. So, the first aspect of his criticism of common notion is a criticism of the intrinsic existence of external bodies, of external things. So, for instance, I will quote a lot. I will quote all these philosophers. So, according to Hume, we may well ask, what causes us to believe in the existence of a body, of bodies in general? But, he adds, it is in vain to ask whether there be body or not. So here, for the people who know philosophy, this means that he completely discards the idea of ontology and retains only the idea of epistemology. Namely, he asks what are the elements in our experience that trigger in us the belief that there exist external bodies. And the evidence is weak, as you will see. Whether there be body or not is a question that cannot be decided because we are not outside ourselves. We just know the elements that trigger in us the belief that there are external objects. Full stop. And the reason why we cannot be sure that there are external body is in this following sentence. Is it possible for our senses to deceive us and represent our perceptions as distinct from ourselves? So it's very well possible that we have sense data. According to the structure of sense data, we believe that there are external bodies, but in fact our senses deceive us. You know, there is a beautiful example in modern times that about the way we construct the notion of an external reality. It's the case of a device that was invented by the physiologist Bakirita in the 70s, in which he could help blind people to see. How did he do that? He did that by putting a device on the back of the people with little dots pressing on the back. But there was a grid of little dots, and therefore it was like, you know, the pixels on the screen. Namely, each little dot was like a point of light, you know. Then there was a camera that was attached to this device on the back, and at first people were asked, what do you feel when the device is on? What do you feel? And people said, okay, what I feel is just tickling on the back, nothing more, tickling on the back. So they identified the sensations they had as sensations on the back. But after a certain time, when they got used to do that, and when they connected the ticklings to the sensations they had by the hands about what they sensed, they suddenly said, I no longer feel ticklings in my back. I see in front of me something external to me. Okay? So here is, you see here in action, a progressive construction of the notion of something external. Before there was nothing external, there was just tickling on the back. And suddenly they say, I see something external to me. So, the question of Hume is exactly this one. How do we do when we start to believe that there are something external to us out of the sensations of our bodies? That's exactly that. So the question of Hume was, what causes us to believe in the intrinsic existence of bodies? And to posit that bodies as external to us. And here is the answer of Hume, which is quite similar to Kant's, as you will see. the coherence and constancy of our perceptions which persuade the opinion of their continuous existence. Okay? So there are repetitions in our perceptions. They come back again and again and again in the same way, at least if we act in a certain way that enables us to recover again and again the same perceptions. And then we say, this constancy of our perceptions are due to the constancy of the existence of something external to us. So, what we have is perceptions. What we see is the possibility we have to make these perceptions recurring again and again. And we interpret this possibility of having repetitive perceptions in terms of the existence of external bodies that trigger that. Okay, but on the other hand, this repetition of perceptions is what allows us to believe in the existence of permanent external bodies. But if we are more careful and attentive, we see that perceptions don't repeat exactly the same. There is always a little variation. And this little variation should make us a little bit diffident about the intrinsic existence of external things. And therefore, the only way for us to keep the notion of the intrinsic existence of external things is not to care too much about the small variations and to pay only attention to the broad repetition of perceptions. And therefore, that's the reason why David Hume said, carelessness and inattention alone can afford us any remedy against the skeptical doubt concerning the intrinsic existence of bodies. Namely, it's only if we don't pay attention to these small variations that we say, this is a substantial, solid, intrinsically existent body. Okay? So I love this quotation. Carelessness and inattention alone can afford us any remedy against skepticism. It's funny because usually people think exactly the other way around. Namely, skepticism comes, according to them, only if we don't pay enough attention to what is there in the world. But here it's exactly the contrary. The second type of skepticism of David Hume is skepticism as to the intrinsic existence of the self. This is very, very Buddhist, actually. Here is what David Hume says. There are some philosophers who imagine we are every moment intimately conscious of the self and are certain both of its perfect identity and simplicity. So some philosophers imagine that we are conscious of the self, but clearly Hume is not among these philosophers. And he said, unluckily, these assertions are contrary to experience, because what we see in experience is not a permanent self. It's a flux of perceptions, feelings, experiences, and so on and so on. And where is the self? You know the story. But he said exactly that. David Hume said, if any impression gives rise to the idea of the self, that impression must continue invariably the same. But there is no impression that is constant and invariable. So there is no permanent self because there is no permanence in our experience. Experience is always in flux. Okay, so how could I grasp myself in my experience? I would like it to be a certain content of my experience, but there is no such content independent of my perceiving something else. When I perceive something else, I think, oh, it's me who is perceiving the something else. So the perception comes with the idea that there is someone, me, who is perceiving this something else. But there is no specific perception of myself, just the belief that there is a myself who is perceiving something else. So I can never catch myself without a perception, because only a perception can give me the idea that there is myself perceiving. And I can never observe anything but the perception. I cannot observe myself. I observe the perception, not myself. I just infer that there is someone, myself, who is perceiving. And he concludes, the identity which we ascribe to a self is only a fictitious one. No identity of the self. Okay? So I think all these sentences could have been written by a Buddhist author, I think. And it's quite accurate analysis of what occurs in experience. Third kind of skepticism is skepticism as to the intrinsic existence of causes. So here it's interesting because the ideas of Hume are very advanced. He doesn't even believe in causes, in the intrinsic existence of causes. Just as, I think, the Madhyamaka thinkers, such as Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, and so on, would criticize the intrinsic existence of cause. They would say, no, even causes are dependently arisen with the effect. They are not intrinsically existent. Okay, suppose, he says, suppose two objects to be presented to us. From the simple consideration of one or both of these objects, we shall never perceive the tie by which they are united. So even if you give me one object at a certain moment and another object at another moment, the mere consideration of these two objects will not give me the idea that the first one is the cause of the second one. It's just a succession, empirical succession, nothing more. Therefore, the necessity of the tie between these two objects is something that exists only in the mind, not in objects. Please notice that he didn't say that there is no tie. He says that the necessity of the tie can only be in our minds. And when people speak of efficient causes and their effects, they intend the idea that there is a necessity of the connection between the two. Necessarily, when you posit object then object B will appear. And this is our idea of causality. There is necessity in it. But in fact, as Hume notices, what we see is only succession, and necessity can only be superimposed by our minds. Okay, now, this is very similar, in fact, to what the Samyutta Nikaya said, this Buddhist text of the sutras. The idea is not that there is a necessary tie or an intrinsic existence of causes. The idea is just that there is regular succession. Here is a quotation. When this is present, that is present. From the arising of this, that arises. When this is absent, that is absent. On the cessation of this, that ceases. There is just concomitance and succession, no necessity here. It's a fact. There is this succession. Okay, now, according to Hume, we may define a cause to be an object precedent and contiguous to another, and where all the objects resembling the former are placed in like relations of precedency and contiguity to those objects that resemble the latter. This is very important also. You cannot say one object is the cause of the other just because there has been a succession between the two of them. In order to build the concept of causality, namely the concept of a necessary connection between causes and effects, you need many of these events, several times, again and again. Again and again, one object similar to A occurs, say A1, A1, A2, A3, A4, and so on. And then after A comes B. After A1 comes B1. After B2 comes after A2 comes B2, and so on and so on. So after similar objects come a series of similar other objects. And in that case, you think, each time A-type objects have occurred, B-type objects have occurred just after. Therefore, A-type objects must be the cause of B-type objects. This is the reasoning. So according to Hume, only the repetition of a certain type of event, not the event itself, the type of event, makes us think that there is a causal connection between the two of them. And I think here again it's quite similar to this idea of a regular succession that is exposed in the sutras. So here again you do not see a certainty about causes. You do not see an absolute existence of causes. Just you see successions and the mind that catches on the succession and says, that there must be something here. So it's the conclusion of the reasoning. It is a constant conjunction of objects, along with the determination of the mind who makes a synthesis between all these events, which constitutes a physical necessity. The necessity here again is imposed by an operation of our minds. But what is there is only a succession. And as you will see, Kant has drawn a lot from Hume, but he was a little bit less skeptical, as you will see. First of all, Kant was, according to himself, Kant was woken up from his dogmatic slumber. That means that Kant, at the beginning, was a dogmatist, a rationalist, not an empiricist. He believed in the intrinsic existence of things. As reason, as concepts, make us believe. Okay. So here is the famous quotation by Kant: "The work of David Hume was the very thing which interrupted my dogmatic slumber." But what is a dogmatic slumber? When Kant speaks of that, and what is dogmatism? In fact, dogmatism is perfectly represented by a sentence of Kant himself back in the 1770, which means back in the period that is called the pre-critical period of Kant. Namely, Kant had two periods in his thought. At first, he was a physicist and a logician and a mathematician. This was the very first period of his thought. Then he was a philosopher, but a philosopher in the school of Leibniz, namely a rationalist, dogmatist philosopher, thinking that concepts open up to intrinsic reality. And then he read Hume, and Hume, as you have seen, was very critical. He deconstructed all the notions of dogmatic philosophy and common sense. And Kant said, oh, well, I think Hume must be right to a certain extent. So, first, and this was only later, namely in 1780s, in the 1780s. So in 1770, Kant wrote the following sentence. What is sensually apprehended is the representations of things as they appear, whereas the intellectual thoughts are the representations of things as they are. This sentence is typical of dogmatism and rationalism. And I think it's deeply averse to Buddhism. Because what this sentence says is that what we see by perception is just non-existent appearance. Okay, maybe it's okay for Buddhists but still in Buddhist epistemology, perception is, even though it has to be criticized, it's still the less uncertain source of knowledge. But the second part of the sentence is completely different, of course, when it says that the intellectual thoughts are the representations of things as they are. So the intrinsic reality, the ultimate reality, is what concepts picture for us. Okay? So concepts give us access to ultimate reality. This can hardly be more averse to Buddhism. And this is what Kant calls dogmatism or dogmatic rationalism. But I think this thought, namely that the intellectual thoughts are the representations of things as they are, still inspire nowadays many scientists. When they say, oh, look my equation here. This equation represents reality as it is. Now I know reality. It's that. It's my concept that has been the elucidator of this reality. Okay, so now the question that happened to Kant was, is reason truly giving us access to things as they are intrinsically or not? And at the end of this decade, namely between 1770 and 1780, Kant arrived to the conclusion that he was completely wrong in 1770, and that indeed reason cannot give us access to things as they are intrinsically. Reason is incapable to do that. It has other capacities, but not this one. And this is why Kant wrote a book called The Critique of Pure Reason. Maybe you don't know why he wrote a book with this title. Critique is clear. He makes a critique of what? Not of reason. Reason is useful, but it has limited use. What he criticizes is pure reason, namely reason without connection with perception. Reason in its purely speculative use. So there are two limited uses of reason. First, giving unity to the manifold of already known phenomena and guiding us in research of new phenomena. So let me explain that. Okay, you see a lot of phenomena, like in Hume, phenomena that are variable, that go from one side to another, and so on, and that are impermanent. And you want to gather them into units that have a certain stability. And you say, this is the site or the phenomenon of an object. So you give unity to the manifold of already known phenomena. But also, with reason, we can be guided to research new phenomena. For instance, when I think this object might have, something hidden in it. I am drawn to open it and to search into its inner constitution. So the idea that there is something in it guides me in the research. Or the idea that I could reach in the long run the intrinsic properties of these objects. Maybe it's completely wrong, but it pushes researchers towards more and more information, more and more phenomena, more and more experiments, and so on and so on. So reason has a limited use of synthesis of phenomena into units that can be taken as permanently existing objects, as if they were permanently existing objects. And on the other hand, this reason that sometimes goes astray because it speculates in excess with its power, yet it can help us as an incentive, as giving us a sort of target, perspective. And it's exactly what Kant said in the following sentence. Because you remember, Hume was a pure empiricist. And he said, what we can see is only sensations, perceptions, and so on, nothing more. And all the rest is pure fabrication. And Kant, in some respects, now agrees with Hume. After having been a rationalist dogmatist, now in his critical period, he agrees with Hume. But he said, maybe Hume is right. Probably he's right by saying that reason goes astray by too much speculating. But we should not completely remove this ability to speculate. Because if we completely abandon this ability to speculate, we no longer have the incentive to make research. Even though this incentive might be an illusion, it's useful. It gives us direction, stamina, I don't know, well, many things. So, it's something I sometimes think when I discuss with scientists. With my own very skeptical and critical stance, I think, okay, I should not remove them too much of their beliefs because their beliefs help them in some way in their research. Okay. So this is what Kant understood very early. At the same time, he was just as skeptical as Hume to a certain extent, and to another, in other aspects, he understood that reason must be kept for certain uses. It no longer pretends to disclose things as they are, but it can help. So how did Kant start his research? He started with consideration of very simple examples of perception. The example of the two hands. As you see, we all have a left hand and a right hand. And they don't completely superpose. If you try to make a superposition of them, you can't. If you do that, that's okay, but here the back is in this direction, and the back of the other hand is in this direction. If you want to put the back of one hand in the same direction as the back of the other hand, then you have the thumbs that don't fit, okay? So you can never fit two hands. They are really different, clearly. Yet, now, when you try to think what is the difference between the right hand and the left hand, there is no answer to that. No concept can give you the difference between the right hand and the left hand. And in order to make us understand this, Kant imagined a thought experiment. He said, let's imagine a universe in which the only thing that exists is just the right hand. Or just one hand. So, if you take this universe with only one hand, and you want to characterize the hand, what will you do? you will draw some relations between the parts of the hand that will be relations between the part of the universe, since now you have admitted that your universe consists only in one hand. So the relations between all the parts of this hand, which are relations between all the parts of the universe, can be written down. The relation between this and that is this distance. Relation between this and that is this distance, and so on and so on. Okay, so you write all these relations between the parts of the hand. And then you ask, is this different from another hand that you would call the left hand? By no means. The inner relations of the right hand and the left hand are exactly the same. So, in the universe in which you have only one hand, you cannot say whether the hand is right or left. It's impossible. The only way you would have to say that this hand is right or left is to compare it with another hand. But by our assumption, there is only one hand in the universe. So clearly, there is no way to posit that the property of being left or being right is an intrinsic property. Being left or being right is no intrinsic property. It can only be a relational property. The right hand is right in comparison with the left hand. Okay, but now, how are these two hands compared? These two hands must be compared from the standpoint of someone who is outside of them. And this is only in relation to this outside perspective that the two hands related. So they relate relatively to a third point of perspective, which is maybe ourselves, our bodies. And so the question is, for Kant, are the left and right relative to our own body, or are they relative to absolute space? So, it's very interesting the way Kant reasons in this work of 1768. He says, okay, the two hands are right and left relative to ourselves, to our bodies. But then he removes by thought his body and asks, relative to what a left hand and a right hand would be indeed different if my body did not exist? Then they would be relative to what he calls absolute space. And here he uses a notion that comes from Newton, the notion of absolute space. But it's very interesting to see that absolute space for him is just a name he gives to the abstract function of my body. My body is the reference point of absolute space, according to him. Okay, so that's the reason why progressively making this connection between what he calls absolute space and the real source of this absolute space, which is my own body, he started to understand that maybe space is not something that exists out there independently of us, and it might be precisely something that he called later an a priori form of sensitivity. Okay, this connection between space and body is what gave him the idea that space might be something that is produced, emanated, so to speak, from ourselves in order to locate all the rest of bodies. So, Now, what the hands teach us about the nature of knowledge. If we stick to this pre-critical philosophy of 1770, we suppose reason reveals things as they are. This is dogmatism. Reason reveals things as they are. Then we notice that there is no conceptual difference between the hands, because no way you could not say something that would distinguish between this hand and this hand. It's impossible. Try to find a word that would distinguish that. The only thing that distinguishes the two hands is that we can see them and see that they are not identical. Or we can do operations of symmetry and so on, and see by these operations that they are not identical. But there is no concept that gives us the sense of an inherent difference between the right hand and left hand. Only external differences that can be superimposed on the hands. Yet these two hands are different. We see them. We see it's very clear. We know that they are different. Therefore, and here it's the reasoning of Kant, therefore, they cannot be things in themselves, but phenomena relative to us. Here is the reasoning, you see. If reason could grasp the difference between left hand and right hand, then we could say by the statement of the text of Kant of 1770 that there is an intrinsic difference between them and that they are things in themselves. But there is no concept that allows us to distinguish inherently between the left hand and the right hand. Therefore, they are not things in themselves. What are they? Phenomena. Just phenomena relative to us. Okay? So here, I think here is the nucleus of Kant's philosophy. The first idea that came to him, that things are not, the visible objects are not things in themselves, they are just phenomena. Okay? So then I told you that Kant arrived also at the conclusion that space is not objective and real, but subjective and ideal, arising by fixed laws from the mind like an outline for the coordination of external sensations. Okay, because since the space, in fact, is the name we give to the system of coordinates that emanate from our body, according to the text of 1768, then it's clear that, in fact, space is subjective and ideal. Okay. The generalization of this move was called by Kant the Copernican Revolution. You know, you have seen yesterday what I said about the Copernican Revolution, namely that there are two elements, in fact, in the Copernican Revolution. First one is that one changes the center of the world. Before, the center of the world was the Earth. After the center of the world, it becomes the Sun. And something like that occurs in Kant, because before, the center of knowledge was the object, and after Kant, or in Kant at least, the center of knowledge becomes the subject. Okay, so there is a difference. The second element of Copernican revolution, as I told you, is that the motion of planets is no longer described in the absolute, but it's described in relation with the human observer on the Earth. So here we have relational knowledge instead of absolute knowledge in Copernicus. And Kant wants to do exactly the same, namely that we have relational knowledge instead of absolute knowledge. So here is the first sentence in which Kant explains his Copernican Revolution. Hitherto, it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects. But all attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by these means have ended in failure. We must therefore try whether we may not have more success if we suppose that the object must conform to our knowledge. We should then be proceeding on the lines of Copernicus. But of course, here you can wonder what Kant means. What does Kant mean when he says that all our attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by these means have ended in failure? What is it? It's very clear, in fact. He's alluding to Aristotelian science, in which people ascribed essences and absolute causes to objects and events. And instead, in Galilean and then Newtonian science, all the qualities that are described are relational qualities, no longer absolute qualities. And moreover, what is done by Newtonian physics is just coordinating phenomena, not trying to inquire into the ultimate essence, own being of things. Okay? So the most successful science is a science that has abandoned the notion of own being. And that's the reason why Kant says that science is only a knowledge of relations. Here are a few quotations by Kant. The determinations of objects express mere relations without being based on anything intrinsic, for such things are not things in themselves, but only appearances. It's very clear. So the determination of objects express mere relations. Okay? And the reason why they express mere relations is that they are phenomena. And they are phenomena because they are relations with ourselves. So it's relations throughout. Science describes relations between objects, and objects are nothing else than phenomena, namely relations between us and them, or between us and what there is. So relations everywhere. No intrinsic properties and no intrinsic existence, once again. Whatever characteristics we are acquainted with in matter are nothing but relations. But among these relations, there are recurring ones through which a determinate object is given to us. You see here an echo of Hume, because Hume said, how do we know that there are objects that look like they are external to us? By observing the recurrence, the repetitions of perceptions. And here it's exactly that. Among the relations we observe, there are some that are recurring. And these recurring relations can be called external objects. So you see, in fact, there are no external objects. There are only a system of relations, including some between us and what there is. And but among these relations, some of them are stabilized, and this stabilization gives us the idea that there are permanently existing outer objects. And here is the confirmation of that. The intrinsic determinations of a phenomenal substance, you see, this is a very interesting expression, phenomenal substance. So it's no longer an intrinsically existing substance, it's just a phenomenal substance. Namely, something that we take, that we deem to be a substance, and yet we have only perceptions. So the intrinsic determinations of phenomenal substance are nothing but relations. It's very strange. The intrinsic determinations are relations. As if he were turning around the notion of intrinsic property and completely transforming it into the concept of relation. And the substance itself is altogether a sum of relations only. Okay, substance. So the word substance comes from Aristotle. It denotes something that is sub, namely behind the intrinsic properties of things. So there is a substrate, a basis for these properties. And here the word substance is completely modified in its meaning because it becomes itself a sum of relations. There is nothing but relations, and what was called by Aristotle a substance is in fact nothing more than a stable bundle of relations. So here is, maybe I should stop here and make a so according to our discussion, it's a place in the Critique of Pure Reason in which Kant used reason to show that reason cannot go as far as it thinks. It cannot speculate about the origins of the world, about the soul, about God, and so on. It has limits. And the limits of reason is its connection with perceptions. Reason is used to connect perception to each other, not more. Okay, so here I will describe a part of the Critique of Pure Reason that is called the Dialectic of Reason. So dialectic means the dispute, the difference between opinions. Okay, for instance, this sentence: a skeptical objection puts proposition and counter-proposition, namely P and not P, in reciprocal opposition to each other. It is therefore seemingly dogmatic on two opposite sides in order to annul entirely any judgment about the object. Okay, this sentence maybe is a little bit difficult to understand at first sight, but then you will see it's not so difficult. That means that in order to show the limits of reason, we should put two propositions, namely one proposition and the contrary of this proposition, in connection to each other, and demonstrate that each one of the two propositions, both P and not P, are not correct. Okay? They are self-contradicting. Both of them. When you have shown that both P and not P self-contradict, then you demonstrate that reason is completely without resource. Because whatever it does, whatever speculation it tries, the view or the proposition falls. So this is called a dilemma. You posit P and P self-contradicts. You posit not P, the contrary of P, and not P self-contradicts. So what should we do? Reason is powerless. Okay? But in order to show that reason is powerless, you use reason. That's what we were alluding to. In Nagarjuna, it's exactly the same, but even more powerful, because it's not only the dilemma that Nagarjuna is using, but the Tetra Lemma. In Sanskrit, Chatuskoti, and in Tibetan, I've written the name, I don't know how to read it. Okay, thank you. So it's the Tetra Lemma or the Chatuskoti. So according to Nagarjuna, emptiness is the relinquishing of all views, namely the view that P, but also the view that not P, the view that both P and not P, and the view that neither P nor not P. All these views are relinquished. For instance, in this Karika, number 25, Nagarjuna says, Nirvana is said to be, Nirvana is neither said to be existent nor to be non-existent. Neither both nor neither are said. So it's exactly a short statement of the Tetra Lemma. And why is it so? Because precisely there is self-contradiction with every thesis. And this is shown in other Karikas. So you see that this dialectic of reason, that means that you show by reason the limits of reason, is quite similar in the two authors, even though it's more detailed and powerful in Nagarjuna. So why is reason sometimes fooling itself? As I told you, the main function of reason is to connect particular experiences to one another by way of concepts. So you have seen a certain experience, then another experience, and you connect them by concepts. For instance, the concept of similarity. You say, oh, this is similar to that, so they both belong to the same species called the horse. Or you say, this is the cause to that, and then you connect the two perceptions by the link of causality. So reason can do that, connect perceptions, but not more. But reason is bold, and it wants to extrapolate this function by trying to speculate on the absolute totality of possible experience. And since it can connect particular experiences, it wants then to totalize experience and to think concepts that gather all experience. But of course, all of experience cannot be experienced. All possible experience cannot be experienced. We experience some experiences. We are finite beings. We don't experience the totality of all possible experience, you know. So this claim of reason is clearly exaggerated because it goes well beyond what we can do. The absolute totality of all experience is no object of actual experience. Reason is thus fooling itself by mistaking its own ideas for real objects. So reason is bold, as I told you. It builds grand ideas, such as totality of all experience, totality of things that it calls the world, the ultimate cause and author of all things that it called God, and so on and so on. But these are, according to Kant, it's exaggerated. They are just ideas of reason, and reason believes that these ideas refer to real things. Hume was very critical about that, even more maybe than Kant, because Kant at least keeps a function to these ideas of reason. He says, don't take them completely seriously as disclosing things as they are, but use them in for practical purposes. Instead, Hume was very dismissive. He said, these things are completely useless. And here is what he said. Let us chase our imagination to the heavens or to the utmost limits of the universe. We never really advanced a step beyond ourselves. So according to Hume, any construct of the mind trying to grasp the totality of things is just a construct, and we just have to recognize it's a construct of our mind, nothing more. But as you will see, so Kant first criticizes all the attempts by reason to go beyond this very simple use. So here is a table in which you will see 4 columns. The first column is the normal function of reason, the function of reason that it uses for connecting perceptions or phenomena. For instance, the function called categorical, in which you ascribe a property to a subject. You say, for instance, the table is green. The table is green. This is what we call categorically ascribing a connection between the table and the color green. Okay? So it connects 2 things. Reason connects always 2 things. What does it connect? It connects the general perception of a table with the general perception of the color green. Okay, so this is the function. Now, the idea that reason extrapolates out of this categorical function of reason is the concept of substance. So it says the grammatical subject of a proposition is, or denotes a substance, something intrinsically existent. So it goes farther than the standard function that is just to connect 2 sets of perception. Wittgenstein said one day, the great mistake, the most important mistake, is to mix up substantives with substances. A substantive is the name we use for a subject, grammatical subject of a proposition. And the substance is the metaphysical idea of something intrinsically existent and solid. But one application of this concept of substance is for ourselves. My ego is a substance. Okay? So the reason, for instance, when I apply a proposition to myself, I say, I'm happy. I am happy. Okay? I is the subject of the grammatical subject of the proposition, and happy is the predicate, the property. Then we think, okay, there is a subject of the proposition, therefore there must be a substantive, therefore there must be a substance. And my ego is a substance. It's stable, inherently existent, and so on and so on. This is the big mistake of reason, when it mixes up the subject of a proposition with a substance. And especially this one, when it mixes up the subject with a personal pronoun, such as I or me, and a substance called the ego. And the dialectic of reason that Kant applies, in this case, in order to dismantle the notion of a permanent ego, is called a parallelism of reason. Okay? So each dialectic has a special name for each modality of deconstructing a notion has a name in Kant. Another function of reason is the hypothetical function. A implies B. A entails B. Sorry. A entails B. So if A, then B. This is a normal function of reason, a function that is used in mathematics, that is used in logic, that is used also to infer very simple things, such as the famous Tibetan example, smoke, therefore fire. So reason uses that. But also reason is ambitious, too much ambitious. It wants to go beyond that, beyond only finding a cause for a certain event. It wants to totalize the complete series of causes and conditions and take it in one mind, in one concept. And what is the concept that totalizes all the causes and conditions? The world. The world is everything. So the concept of the world is an extrapolation of what we see in our immediate environment. We totalize everything. But as Kant pointed out, we don't have an experience of the world. We have an experience of our immediate environment, not of the totality of the world. You could say, oh, but there is a science called cosmology. And this is precisely the idea of Kant, a science called cosmology that claims to speak of the world as a totality. And nowadays it has some successes, in fact. But if you see carefully how, not what scientists say, but what they do, you will see that cosmology is just a study of certain phenomena that are visible here and now on the Earth. And then we try to make a big construct out of these observations. In particular, there is something that is well known by all cosmologists, is that not all the world can be seen even in principle. Why? Because there is the limitation of the velocity of light. And therefore, what we see is not the world as a whole, it's just a light cone. The light cone that corresponds to the limit of the velocity of light. And so, when the reason wants to extrapolate the simple analysis, local analysis of causes and effects to the whole of the world, it generates antinomies. The same, maybe I will not describe too much the third point. The third extrapolation of reason yields the concept, not the concept of God. So the first extrapolation yielded the concept of a permanent ego. The second extrapolation yielded the idea of a totality called the world or the universe. And the third extrapolation of reason yields a concept called God. And the dialectic, namely the place in which even the concept of God is put in jeopardy, is called the ideal of reason. Because according to Kant, you will see that later, according to Kant, all these concepts, namely the concept of an ego, the concept of the world, and the concept of God, even though they are completely wrong, they have a function for our mind. They help us to a certain extent and in certain circumstances to guide our actions. For instance, cosmology the idea of a totality of the world can trigger the science called cosmology. Even though it's not about the whole of the world, still it gathers new and interesting knowledge. The concept of God also. Why is it connected to the ideal? Because the concept of God encapsulates our ideals of morals, ideals of omniscient beings, and so on and so on. We think of an omniscient being because we want to know more. We think of an infinitely good God because we want to be good, and so on and so on. It's an embodiment of our ideals. Okay. So according to Kant, these are useful even though they are wrong. It's interesting. Maybe useful. Not for everywhere. Not for everyone. Okay, let's take an example. Maybe I will not give all my examples because there are many. But the antinomy of the beginning of the world. I think it's interesting for Buddhists especially because the Buddhist idea is that the world is beginningless. So, but according to Kant, both theses at any rate are self-contradictory. And I think deep reflection, even in Buddhism, would yield exactly the same conclusion, namely the two theses, beginningless or not beginningless, are not valid at the end of the day. So let's suppose that the world has a beginning, and let's use a mode of reasoning called reductio ad absurdum. Namely, you consider the opposite thesis, and you show that the opposite thesis cannot be true, therefore the thesis is true. Apparently. Because after you use exactly the same reasoning for the antithesis, namely reductio ad absurdum, you show that the thesis is absurd, and therefore both the thesis and the antithesis are discarded. So let's start with the thesis, according to which the world has a beginning. So suppose the contrary. Suppose that, in fact, the world is endless and has no beginning. Then its concept can be the object of no finite experience. Therefore, this claim is completely speculative. We cannot know that the universe is beginningless and endless. We can speculate that it is so, but we cannot know. You will see later that there is a very important and interesting point about that. Now, let's come to the antithesis. The antithesis, the world is endless and without beginning. So we posit this thesis now, and we want to prove it. Suppose that the world has a beginning, then there was an empty time before the onrise of the world. Why did the world suddenly appear at one moment, one particular moment of this empty time? There is empty time, nothing, no reason for anything to appear. Why? People say, oh, it's God. But why God? Why does he exist? And secondly, why did he choose this very moment to create God? There is no reason even for him to choose to create the world at that very moment. So, since the opposite thesis is rejected, then the antithesis is accepted. So, you see that both the thesis and the antithesis are rejected. This is called a dilemma. Reason contradicts itself. It cannot yield a completely convincing conclusion. Now, what is very interesting is that Kant doesn't content himself by saying, okay, these two theses are rejected, and reason contradicts itself. He tries to analyze the motivations of the people who defend either the thesis or the antithesis, either the idea that the world has a beginning or the idea that the world is endless and without beginning. And it is what Kant calls the interest of reason. Why do some people prefer the thesis? Why do some people prefer the antithesis? Since at any rate reason cannot give a completely convincing answer, and yet some people strive to argue in favor of one or the other. So why? Why is it so? Well, and I think here Kant has a point. He says that the thesis is underpinned by what he called the dogmatic interest of reason, namely the desire of reason to find a foundation for everything. So the idea that the world has a beginning at least has the advantage of thinking, oh, there must be a foundation of everything, a point at which the world is created, and there was a cause of this creation, for instance, God. And therefore, the cause of this creation is the foundation of everything and the foundation of the world. So the interest of the people who assert the world has a beginning is to afford a foundation. And when the mind has a foundation, usually it's happy. It says, oh, that's firm. I can believe in something. I feel content, at rest. Things are not slipping in my hands. Okay, that's the reason why some people defend the thesis, the world has a beginning. But the antithesis, what is the interest of those who defend the antithesis according to which the world is endless? The interest of reason here is an empirical interest, because here reason dispels dreams of a foundation and concentrates on local series of phenomena. By pushing the beginning and the end of the world far away in the distance, at a distance in which we don't even care about them, we concentrate on what is useful for us here and now. And I think maybe, I venture to think that it was probably the idea of the Buddha. He probably believed or had the feeling that by saying that the world is endless and beginningless was not a way to assert the truth, absolute truth of this thesis, but just saying, don't care about the beginning and the end of the world. Please concentrate on important issues here and now, sufferance, for instance, and suffering and so on. So maybe just a hypothesis for you. So you see, reason can yield no final conclusion. This is a very Madhyamaka style reasoning, and yet it can be interesting for reason to stick to one or the other of these two theses, either because it seeks a foundation or because it doesn't care about foundations and wants to act in the present. Okay, so I think probably it enables us to understand something about the fundamental choices of Buddhism in this. So there are many other reasonings of this type. Just as in Nagarjuna you find karika after karika of criticism of views, here there are many, of course. There is, for instance, a criticism of the substantial self. And Kant finally says what he writes at the end of the slide: whether I myself as a phenomenon of the internal sense exist apart from my power of presentation must be denied. That means that the I, the ego, has no intrinsic existence. The only existence we have is relative to an attempt to bring out the appearance of ourselves. So there is no absolute existence, but only a relative existence. Okay, here I must say I have little time. So maybe I can skip that, because I've said a lot about that in the last days when I was speaking of science, and go to something about ethics. So here is another difficulty. This time it has to do with ethics, with human behaviors and human needs. It's a problem of freedom. According to theoretical reason, every phenomenon is governed by the laws of nature. Okay, so most scientists would say, oh, freedom is an illusion. We all know that. We all know that we are not free, since our behavior is ruled by the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, and so on and so on. So there is no freedom. So in the domain of phenomena, there is no room for freedom. Apparently, we are not free. But beware, says Kant, we are not only spectators of phenomena, we are actors. We don't see us from outside acting and saying, oh, we are like a puppet acting out of influences of chemistry, physics, and so on. We are the body who is acting. And this makes a huge difference for us. And so, from the standpoint of the actor, everything looks as if we were free, because we are, in our mind, we are determined by nothing in particular except our wishes and our ideals also. So, and here is the sentence that makes it quite clear. Every being that cannot act otherwise than under the idea of freedom is precisely for this reason actually free in a practical respect. So, what does it mean? It means that when you act, you don't sit and wait and think, oh, I should stay still and wait until the forces of physics and chemistry have made me act. You don't do that. You act under the idea that you are free to act, and you do things. So, from your standpoint, you are free. From the standpoint of someone who would see you from outside, you are not free. Okay? But so in the present naturalistic framework of Western science, it's normal that people say, that scientists say, we are not free. Because for them, what is real is only matter that appears under a microscope or a telescope. But from the standpoint of we human beings, what is real, what is more real than anything, is where we stand now. Our experience, our will, our desires, our quietness, whatever there is in our experience. And from that standpoint, we are free. And it's exactly what Kant said. A being who cannot act otherwise than under the idea of freedom, namely as if it or he or she were free, is actually free in a practical respect. So there is a sense in which this is real freedom, not fake freedom, because one doesn't consider only the outer standpoint, the standpoint of the science of nature, but one also considers the inner standpoint, the standpoint of the actor, agent. So this is Kant's very subtle idea about freedom. It's not. He doesn't say that science is wrong by saying that we act under the determination of physical and chemical factors. He doesn't say that. He just said we don't really care about that, because from the point of view of ourselves, we are free. You see, it's very interesting. Very interesting. It can be discussed. There are so many. I think there have been thousands of papers that have been written on this topic. Okay, but now second very important point in Kant's ethics is that when we act along with reasons, we are free in practice. We don't act under the push of causes, we act under the attraction of ideals. We want to make the good. We want to behave as better human beings, and so on and so on. So we are attracted by our own ideals. And therefore, the laws of physics and chemistry, maybe they don't cease to act, but they become irrelevant, because there is a level of understanding of our own behavior and a level of determination, self-determination of our own behavior that is, I would say, emergent with respect to the layer of processes ruled by physics and chemistry. So the processes ruled by physics and chemistry in our bodies become completely irrelevant. What is relevant is what we wish to do. There is a beautiful sentence by Jean-Paul Sartre, maybe I can quote it to you. I have it in French. So, notre être est fait de ce que nous avons à être. That means our being as human beings is made of what we have to be. We are what we have to be. We are what we dream to be, what our ideals pushes us to be. That's the idea. So the idea of Kant is a little bit this one. Okay, maybe the laws of nature say that we are bodily determinate and so on, yet what determines us to act is certainly not the laws of physics and chemistry. It's something emergent with respect to that, namely our aims, our goals, our ideals. So we are looking for the good because we are reasonable beings, according to Kant. This is also very controversial. The idea of an ethics based on reason has been very much challenged after Kant. But at least the general idea that the purpose of our action goes beyond our biological condition is very important. So, according to Kant, reason can formulate a proper statement of our ideals, a statement that should be universally valid. That's the reason why reason is so important, because reason strives towards universal truth or universal validity. And therefore, when reason posits ethical rules, this ethical rule should be universal. Even more importantly, the fact that it should be universal imposes its own content. Example, the categorical imperative, which is the central rule of Kant ethics, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction. Well, maybe it's a little bit difficult. I hope you understand, but I can explain it to you. That means when you do an action, do it only if you can wish that everybody do that. For instance, if you do something good, you wish everybody to do something good, because you will also be you will also benefit from that good, and so on and so on. For instance, if you take all the samosa for you in the box, you cannot wish that everybody does the same, because if someone else does the same, you will not have one samosa for you. So you would be annoyed, and so on and so on. You see the idea. The idea is that you must wish. You must act in such a way that you wish that all the others do the same. Second point of the categorical imperative: act in such a way that you treat humanity never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. This is very clear. You don't have to use other beings. Other beings are not just means for you. They are human beings. They have own existence, their wish to be happy, and so on and so on. Maybe the only point that a Buddhist would change here is replace human beings by sentient beings, isn't it? So act in such a way that you treat every sentient being never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end for itself. Okay, so here is a table, apparently almost the same as the one I showed you previously. But here you will see what is the use of these extrapolations of reasons. I remind you that I said that according to Kant, reason goes too far when it tries to extrapolate its limited functions of associating perceptions to one another to totalize these associations. But even though reason is wrong in doing that, reason also affords us, by doing that, a new incentive to act. By the very illusion it produces, it pushes us to act in the right direction, according to Kant. So it's not completely negative. It's this exaggeration, this extrapolation of reason is not entirely useless. It can be very important in practice in our lives. So the word in practice is very important. In theory, reason is completely wrong to extrapolate its own modes of functioning. But in practice, it can be useful. Okay, for instance, when reason postulates the intrinsic existence of the self, it's wrong, but according to Kant, and this is a matter of discussion with Buddhism because it's clearly different, it can be useful to do that. Why? Because it gives you the sense that you are responsible for your actions. You say, okay, if I do something wrong, then myself, my inner self, will be defiled, and therefore I'm guilty. This is the basis for guilt, for sin, and so on and so on. So, according to Kant, it's a very useful thing for morals. But now we know, well, you know more than I do, that there can be a very powerful ethics without sin and without the sense of guilt. Okay? You just have to cultivate the good qualities. Now, another postulate of reason is freedom. Here again, there is no proof of it. Reason goes too far by postulating it, but it is a moral postulate, because when we act under the idea of freedom, then here again we submit our acts to the possibility of judgments by the others and judgments by the society. So, for instance, imagine that in a trial, in a tribunal, someone says, I'm not responsible for my acts. It's my physics and chemistry that determined me to act this way. Then there is no law, no possible law, no possible judgment, and so on and so on. You may think that it's not useful or not good, but at any rate, society works this way. It works by deeming people responsible of their actions. And finally, God, postulate of reason. It's still a postulate of reason. There is no proof of God. Every proof of the existence of God has been criticized in the Dialectic of Reason by Kant. So Kant is a non-believer. But God can be a name for an ideal. it is a moral postulate because it's a name we give to striving towards the supreme good. So even though God is not justified in any rational and theoretical terms, it can be useful in practical life. It can be useful, but here again, one can dispense with it, apparently. Okay. I remember, by the way, I remember having been invited in a conference in Vatican, so by the Catholic Church, and I was very surprised because I've heard one talk by a bishop, and he was expounding the morals of Kant, and especially the status Kant gives to God, namely just as the name of a regulative ideal for doing good. And strangely, I was stunned because the bishop said, this is very acceptable by the Catholic Church. Nice. My personal thought was, gosh, if they accept that, then it means that they need something to feed their thought, because clearly Kant doesn't say that God exists. He just says it's a moral postulate, nothing more. So here again in Buddhism, do you need such moral postulate? Apparently not. But maybe there are other ways to crystallize the moral postulates. One of them is, for instance, the respect for teachers, for masters, maybe. So this is a matter of discussion because I don't have all the answers here, and I hope you will add some ideas to this sketch of Kant's theory of ethics.